Marin understood very early on that in their home, the most important thing wasn't love or even care, but the ability to leave the room. Silence, discretion, and the ability to disappear at the right moment were prized in this house. Laughter was out of place, loud footsteps were dangerous, and questions were unnecessary. Marin learned all this long before she could write her name correctly. Her younger sister was named Madison. She was born with a serious congenital heart defect, and from that day on, the family's life changed forever. Doctors, examinations, pills, machines, anxious nights, and the constant expectation of bad news became the backdrop of their existence. Their mother, Nora, said that Madison was their test and their destiny. Their father, Daniel, remained silent, but worked harder and harder, as if trying to overcome his fear with money. Marin was 5 years older than Madison. When her sister was born, Marin could already read and sincerely believed there would be more joy in the house. She couldn't understand why all the adults suddenly started whispering, and her requests were put off until later. That later never came. Every morning began the same way. Nora rose before dawn and went first thing to Madison's nursery. There she sat, listening to her breathing, checking her pulse, counting the seconds between heartbeats. Marin watched from the hallway, already dressed and ready for school. She stood pressed against the wall, waiting to slip quietly into the kitchen, lest she be caught in the crossfire. "Sweetheart, how are you feeling?" Mom whispered, leaning over Madison's bed. Marin knew that walking in now and saying good morning would seem selfish. So she remained silent. Marin learned to get ready for school on her own. She ironed her own clothes, packed her own backpack, and made her own breakfast. Sometimes it was toast with peanut butter, sometimes an apple. The refrigerator always had special foods for Madison. No salt, no sugar, with a precise calorie balance. Marin knew not to touch them, even if she was really hungry. Her father would come home late. His boots would thud dully on the floor, and Marin could gauge his mood by the sound. If his footsteps were heavy, it was best to go indoors. If they were quick, she could say hello discreetly. He almost always walked straight to Madison, asking the same question. "How's my baby?" At such moments, Marin would stand off to the side, like a piece of furniture. Sometimes, her father would pass her by, without even noticing. "You're a big boy now," he would say if she tried to get his attention. "Understand, I don't care about you right now." And Marin understood. The years passed. Madison was taken to clinics across Colorado, then to other states. Nora quit her job to be with her youngest daughter constantly. Marin returned from school to an empty house. She did her homework on her own. She signed up for extracurricular activities on her own. She also canceled them on her own because her mother had no time to drive her. Teachers called Marin remarkably independent. Classmates considered her quiet and a little strange. No one knew that for her, silence wasn't a character trait, but a survival skill. By adolescence, Marin had stopped expecting things. She didn't expect praise for her grades, didn't expect help with her homework, didn't expect questions about her day. She learned to live as if she had no family, only obligations. When it was time to think about college, Nora was busy preparing Madison for another surgery. Daniel was negotiating a loan with the bank. Marin applied for the scholarships herself. She searched for grants, filled out applications, and wrote motivational letters at night. The letter about a full academic grant arrived in the spring. Marin held it in her hands, disbelieving her eyes. It was her ticket. Not just to university, but to a life where her existence didn't depend on someone else's diagnosis. She ran home, her heart pounding as if she'd just had surgery. Nora was standing in the kitchen, preparing dinner for Madison, carefully weighing the ingredients. "Mom," Marin said, handing over the letter. "I got in. It's a full grant. You don't have to pay." Nora glanced at the paper, nodded, and said, "Okay, dear. Please set the plates. Madison needs to eat on time." At that moment, something inside Marin finally snapped into place. She realized she would never be the center of this house. And for the first time, this realization didn't hurt. It brought clarity. When she left for Seattle to study, the farewell was brief. Nora was rushing to a doctor's appointment. Daniel gave her some cash and told her to be careful. No one cried. Maren cried on the bus. But these weren't tears of grief, but of release. Seattle greeted Maren with rain. It was small and insistent, as if the city had warned her from the start. Nothing would be easy here, but everything would be real. She stepped off the bus with one suitcase and a backpack, looked around, and for the first time in a long time, felt not anxiety, but a strange, piercing excitement. Here, no one knew she had a younger sister with a heart condition. No one expected her to be understanding, patient, or self-sacrificing. Here, she was simply Maren. The dorm turned out to be noisy, cramped, and surprisingly vibrant. Her roommates argued over music, threw things around, and laughed into the night. At first, Maren flinched at every loud noise, but gradually she began to relax. No one told her to keep it down. No one looked at her reproachfully. The world didn't collapse because she existed loudly. She was completely captivated by her studies. She chose economics and communications because, deep down, she always wanted to understand how systems, families, companies, relationships work. The professors quickly noticed her. Not because of her loud voice or charisma, but because of her rare ability to listen, analyze, and see beyond the obvious. Maren absorbed knowledge with the voracity of someone who had lived on emotional starvation for too long. She worked part-time at the university library. The silence there was different, not forced, but voluntary. In the evenings, she sat at the counter, helping students find books, and caught herself smiling. Just like that. For no reason. The house rarely rang. Usually, they were short conversations with Nora, who would start with a question, "Are you okay?" and almost immediately launch into stories about Madison. New tests, new doctors, new fears. Maren listened calmly. She no longer expected anyone to ask how she was coping. After her sophomore year, she rented a small room near campus. For the first time, she had a space all to herself. A small window, a narrow bed, a desk against the wall. She bought a cheap blanket and a mug with the words, "You can do this," written on it, and suddenly burst into tears while putting away her things. Not from sadness. From the feeling of finally being able to breathe. In her junior year, she met Ethan. He wasn't the one she would have chosen before. Too open, too lively, too attentive. He worked in the student media center, wrote articles, and always asked irrelevant questions. That's what drew him to Maren. "You always listen as if you really care," he said one day as they sat in a cafe after a lecture. That's rare. Maren didn't know what to say. For her, listening wasn't a virtue, but a habit. But with Ethan, that habit ceased to be one-sided. He asked about her thoughts, about her fears. And most unusually, he waited for answers. Their relationship developed slowly. Maren wasn't good at being the center of attention and initially withdrew when Ethan showed concern. But he didn't push. He was simply there. Gradually, she allowed herself to trust. Toward graduation, Maren received an internship offer at a large marketing firm in Portland. It was an opportunity she had never dreamed of. She accepted it without consulting her parents. Ethan supported her without hesitation. "This is your path," he said. "I believe in you." The move was a new beginning. The work was challenging, but Maren quickly proved herself. She had a knack for spotting weaknesses in strategies, proposing innovative solutions, and taking responsibility. A year later, she was hired full-time. The salary was higher than she had ever received. That's when her parents started calling more often. At first, it seemed innocent. Questions about work, about life. Then, cautious hints. Medical bills. Unexpected expenses. Loans. Maren transferred the money without further ado. She didn't feel anger. Rather, a strange satisfaction. Now she had what they had always lacked. When Ethan proposed, it happened quietly, in private. He simply took her hand during a walk and said he wanted to be by her side forever. Maren agreed, without a second's hesitation. They had a modest wedding. Friends, a park, a warm evening. Her parents came, but Nora talked about Madison almost the entire time. Maren wasn't bothered. She was busy with her own life. A year after the wedding, Maren learned she was pregnant. Fear washed over her instantly. She was afraid of history repeating itself, afraid of failing, afraid of becoming like her mother. But Ethan was there. He held her hand and assured her they could get through this together. The pregnancy went smoothly. Their daughter, Ellie, was born healthy. When Maren held her for the first time, something inside her clicked. She promised herself she would never feel like this little girl was left out. Happiness proved fragile. A few months after Ellie's birth, Ethan died in a car accident on the way to a business meeting. Maren's world collapsed in an instant. For the first few weeks, she lived on autopilot. She fed her daughter, changed diapers, answered phones. The insurance money arrived quickly, but it didn't matter. She needed help. Not financial. Human. She called Nora. "Mom," she said, struggling to find the words. "I'm having a hard time. I really need help. Can you come over, at least for a while?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Maren," Nora finally said. "You know I can't stress myself out right now. I have high blood pressure. And there's so much to worry about with Madison. Maybe you could hire someone?" Maren closed her eyes, silently. She already knew the answer, but hearing it still hurt. "I understand," she said quietly. "Thank you." She coped on her own. She found a nanny. She returned to work. She built a new routine. The pain didn't go away, but life went on. And somewhere deep inside Maren, a thought began to form that was impossible to turn away from. If she could always cope alone, then she had the right to decide who she allowed into her life. After Ethan's death, Maren's life began to resemble a long, windowless hallway. She moved forward because she couldn't stop. Ellie was growing, demanding attention, care, and warmth, and that was what kept Maren from completely collapsing. In the morning, she rose before the alarm, fed her daughter, took her to the nanny, went to work, returned home, put Ellie to bed, and only then allowed herself to sit in silence, staring at the wall. Work became her salvation. She was valued at the office. She received projects one after another, and each successfully completed contract was a small victory over the chaos within. Her colleagues saw her as a strong, collected woman. No one knew that sometimes she locked herself in the bathroom, silently crying into paper towels. Calls from her parents became more and more frequent. At first, Nora was interested in Ellie, but her interest was superficial, as if they were talking about a distant acquaintance rather than a granddaughter. Then the conversations invariably turned to problems. Madison's medical bills were mounting. Daniel's hours were being cut at work. The fear of losing their home was becoming more and more real. Maren helped. She transferred money without discussing the amounts. Each time she pressed the confirm payment button, she convinced herself that she was doing it not out of a sense of duty, but because she could, because she wanted to, because she was strong. But somewhere inside, a quiet irritation was growing, which she studiously ignored. When Ellie turned 3, Nora first invited Maren to move in with them. Her parents' house was in the suburbs of Sacramento, far from the office, but the idea was presented as a thoughtful gesture. "We could help with Ellie," Nora said over the phone. "It would make things easier for you. And we'd feel better having you around." Maren hesitated. She loved her apartment, her little world with Ellie, where everything was predictable and safe. But she could see how tired she was. She saw how money was being spent not only on her family, but also on other people's debts. In the end, she agreed. For Ellie's sake. For the illusion of a family she'd never truly had. The move went quickly. Maren rented the apartment to reliable tenants, signing a long-term contract. Ellie enjoyed the big house, the garden, and her grandparents. The first few weeks seemed almost happy. Nora really helped. She picked Ellie up from preschool, cooked dinners, read bedtime stories. Daniel became more gentle, talked more, sometimes even joked. Maren tried not to think about how her daily commute to work now took almost 2 hours. She told herself it was temporary. That family was all about compromise. She took on the loan her parents had taken out several years ago. At the time, it seemed like the right decision. They couldn't handle it. She could. But gradually, everything began to return to normal. Nora increasingly complained of fatigue, blood pressure, and back pain. Help with Ellie became sporadic. Sometimes, Maren would come home and find her daughter exhausted, watching TV, clutching a bag of cookies. It was hard for me today, Nora defended herself. I'm not young anymore. Maren remained silent. She remembered how, a few years ago, the same woman had sat for hours by Madison's bedside, without complaining. 6 months later, Nora bluntly admitted she couldn't cope with the child anymore. You should get a nanny, she said, not looking Maren in the eye. Maren hired her. It was humiliating and hurtful, but she pretended everything was fine. Every month she continued to pay the mortgage. Every month she convinced herself that it wasn't much longer, that everything would get better. When Daniel recovered and returned to work, Maren hoped the workload would ease. But it didn't. The money continued to drain. And conversations about Madison grew increasingly tense. She lived separately, rarely called, but her shadow still hung over the house. One evening, Maren's parents sat her down at the kitchen table. Ellie was already asleep. We need to talk, Nora began, and Maren immediately realized that nothing good would come. The mortgage isn't paid off yet.
We need more time.
Maybe you could stay with us a little longer? Maren felt a tightening in her stomach. She thought about her apartment, her independence, and how easily she had given it up. I'll think about it, she said, even though she already knew she'd agree. She always agreed. The decisive moment came unexpectedly. One evening, returning from work, Maren saw Madison's car in the yard. She was leaning against the door, pregnant, radiant, and completely confident. Nora was fussing around her as if years hadn't passed. Are you cold? She asked. Come in quickly. The familiar atmosphere reigned in the house again. Madison became the center. All the conversations, plans, and worries revolved around her. Ellie faded into the background. Maren into third place. At dinner, Madison announced that she planned to give birth here. Maren froze. Memories flashed in her mind. The phone call after Ethan's death, the refusal, the indifference. She looked at her mother and suddenly realized that all this time she'd been hoping for a miracle. That one day she would be chosen. But there would be no miracle. After Madison's arrival, the house seemed to have changed hands again. The air became thick and tense, as if before a thunderstorm. Maren felt it physically, as if the walls were pressing against her chest. She watched her mother transform back into the same Nora from her childhood, fidgety, anxious, lost in caring for her youngest daughter. Everything repeated itself with frightening precision, only now Maren was a grown woman and a mother, not a quiet girl in the hallway. Madison settled into the guest room, but quickly took over the entire house. Her bags migrated to the bathroom, her cosmetics to the kitchen table, and her phone conversations filled the space late into the night. Nora brought her food in bed, brewed special herbal teas, called doctors, and canceled her own appointments. Ellie tried to show her aunt her drawings a couple of times, but Madison only nodded absent-mindedly, staring at her phone. Maren increasingly found herself returning home later than usual. She stayed late at the office, took long commutes, just to put off returning home. But home was still waiting, and every evening confirmed her worst fears. Conversations about Madison's future child became more and more concrete. They discussed the nursery, the furniture, the routine. One day, Maren heard Nora say excitedly, "We'll make a nursery in Maren's room, and we can move Ellie closer to us. It'll be more comfortable." These words hit harder than a scream. Maren stood outside the door and felt a wave rising within her that she could no longer contain. The last drops fell that evening when she returned home with groceries. It had been a hard day. Ellie had been cranky since the morning, and a project at work had fallen through. Maren dreamed of only one thing: hugging her daughter and going to bed. She walked into the yard and immediately saw the scattered boxes and bags. Her heart skipped a beat. Ellie was sitting on the porch steps, hugging her knees, crying. "Mommy," she sobbed, rushing to Maren. "Auntie said we're in the way. She told us to go away." Maren felt something inside her break completely. She left the bags on the ground and entered the house. Nora, Daniel, and Madison were sitting in the living room. Everyone fell silent when they saw her face. "What does this mean?" Maren asked, trying to keep her voice even. "Why are my things outside? Why is my baby crying?" "You've got it all wrong," Nora began, but Madison interrupted. "We just wanted to free up some space," she said irritably. "I need some peace right now. It's bad for the baby." "Which baby?" Maren's voice wavered. "What about mine? Doesn't it bother you when you throw out his things?" "Maren, calm down," Daniel interjected. "Don't make a scene." And then everything that had been building up for years burst forth. Maren spoke loudly. She didn't shout, but every word was saturated with pain and truth. She spoke of her childhood, of the silence, of how she had always been understanding, of being left alone with a newborn after her husband's death, of how she paid their debts, saved the house, and sacrificed her life for the illusion of family. "I gave you everything," she said, "and you chose her. Again. Even now." Madison rolled her eyes. "Nobody forced you," she said coldly. "You made this all up yourself." Nora threw up her hands. "You've always been so dramatic," she said. "Think about your sister. She can't be nervous right now." Maren looked at them and suddenly felt a strange calm. Everything fell into place. "Then listen carefully," she said. "I'm leaving.
Today.
And I'm never coming back. This is our home," Daniel barked. "Get out if you don't like it." Maren didn't answer. She went outside, picked up Ellie, and began packing. The night was warm, but inside it was cold. They left for the nearest hotel. Ellie fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from crying. Maren sat on the edge of her bed, feeling no guilt for the first time in a long time. Only emptiness and determination. The next day, she found temporary housing near work. She called her tenants and gave them notice of the legal termination. She did everything precisely and collectedly, just like at work. The first weeks were difficult. Ellie asked questions. Maren answered honestly, neither blaming nor excusing. She talked about boundaries, about safety, about how love shouldn't hurt. When they returned to their apartment, Maren felt at home for the first time in years. Here, no one demanded sacrifice. Here, she could breathe. A few months passed. Work picked up. Ellie started laughing again. Maren opened a savings account for her daughter and another one for herself. Not for a rainy day, but for the future. She didn't call her parents. They didn't call her. And in this silence, finally chosen by herself, Maren began to live. Almost 7 months had passed since the day Maren closed the door of her parents' house behind her. Time hadn't completely healed the pain, but it had made it quieter, deeper, more bearable. The pain had ceased to be a scream and had become a scar, a reminder that she had survived. Life was gradually returning to a steady rhythm. Ellie returned to her old kindergarten, where she was greeted as if she had never left. The girl laughed again, chatted incessantly on the way home, and asked to read the same story every night before bed. Maren watched her with special attention, as if each day she were reaffirming to herself that she had done everything right. Work became a source of confidence. Maren received a promotion that had previously seemed unattainable. Management trusted her with complex projects, and clients respected her for her directness and precision. She no longer lived in survival mode. She was building. For the first time in years, she had evenings free of worry. She could sit on the sofa, drink tea, and not wait for a call with bad news. She stopped checking her phone every 5 minutes. Only occasionally, late at night, when the house was falling asleep, would images of the past surface in her memory. Not as an accusation, but as a quiet sadness for something that never happened. Maren didn't try to force her parents out of her life. She simply let the distance do its work. No letters, no calls. She knew that if she took a step forward, everything would start again. And she could no longer return to the old version of herself. One Sunday, there was a knock at the door. Maren wasn't expecting anyone. Ellie was drawing at the table, humming to herself. Maren walked to the door and peered through the peephole. Her heart sank painfully. Nora and Daniel stood on the threshold. Nora was holding the baby in her arms. Maren didn't open the door right away. She took a deep breath, as if about to dive underwater, and only then turned the handle. Maren, Nora began, her voice trembling. We need to talk. Maren didn't invite them in. She remained in the doorway, a symbolic boundary between the past and the present. They looked different. Older. Tired. Daniel leaned on a cane. Nora was pale, with dark circles under her eyes. The baby in her arms was asleep. It's Madison's baby, Nora said, as if Maren couldn't guess. She's gone. We don't know where she is. Maren was silent. We need help, Daniel continued. We're failing. The house is in jeopardy. The creditors are pressing. You've always been strong. These words would once have been a hook. Now they rang hollow. I know why you came, Maren said calmly. And my answer is no. Nora burst into tears. How can you? She sobbed. This is family. This child is innocent. I know, Maren replied. But I'm innocent too. I'm not abandoning him. I'm abandoning you and this system where my life is a resource. Nora's voice grew sharp. You're cruel, she said. We raised you. Maren nodded. You allowed me to grow up on my own. And now I'm using that skill. Daniel stepped forward. We're going to lose our home, he said. Is that what you want? Maren looked him straight in the eye. You already made a choice when you threw my child out into the street. Today, you're simply facing the consequences. The neighbor's door opened slightly. Someone was listening, but Maren didn't care. Please, she said, quieter now. Go away, and don't come back. She closed the door. For a moment, voices, crying, and banging echoed behind it. Then, everything went silent. Ellie walked up to her and took her hand. Is that Grandma? She asked. Maren crouched down and hugged her daughter. Yes, she said honestly. But sometimes people don't know how to be who they're supposed to be. Ellie thought for a moment and nodded. It's good that you can do it, she said. That night, Maren couldn't sleep for a long time. She thought about the child left without a mother, about Madison, about Nora and Daniel. There was sadness, but not guilt. Compassion, but not self-sacrifice. She knew, sometimes the healthiest choice is not to save. More time passed. Life went on. Ellie grew up confident, loved, protected. Maren taught her simple things. That love doesn't need to be earned, that boundaries are normal, that running away from pain isn't betrayal. Sometimes Maren looked at old photographs and felt a slight longing for what never happened. But then she looked at her daughter and understood. She had broken the chain. Freedom doesn't need justification. It simply is. And Maren finally allowed herself to live.